Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a cat nose and the mouth in acrylics. Now regardless of the head position, so this is of course a slightly side view, but regardless of that I would approach the nose in the same way. Now I'm using Mars Black here and a small round brush and mapping in where the nostrils are. Now a big tip for this stage is not necessarily all nostrils are going to be black. It will very much depend on the cat and the reference photo, the lighting and so on. Now in some cases it's more of a darker orange, a reddish tint that's needed for the nostrils, but this is something as always to study closely in our reference photo. Now the reason I start with the nostrils is because the placement of the nostrils, the size of the nostrils can really affect the overall look of the nose, and even if someone doesn't have a copy of your reference photo, if the nostrils are wrong, it's very obvious. So this is why I always start here. I make sure that I'm happy with that before I then begin with the other sections. So now I've made those adjustments to the nostrils, I'm happy with that. I can now start to block in more of the nose colour. Now my biggest tip here is if you're working from a darker background, like I am here, that I'm then painting in white first and then putting in the colour that I want for the nose. Now building up the colour of any animal, the nose, the eyes, the fur, whatever it may be, it needs to be done in stages. Now the layering process is really important. If I'd have started using this pink on top of the green, the pink is not going to show up because it's a little bit more translucent. So it's going to be able to show that greener tint through it. The pink's therefore going to have a bit more of a muddier look, and of course that's something I want to avoid. So by starting light to dark here, I'm able to capture the values of the nose, the colour of the nose more effectively. Now my personal preference is to work in small individual sections rather than whole individual layers. I just find I'm more motivated by this approach. I like to be able to see those smaller areas look more realistic. I find it very encouraging and I don't then get overwhelmed by that layering process. So once I was happy with that base foundation of the nose, I can then, while I'm waiting for that to dry, start building in the outside where it starts to merge onto the fur. Now this darker section around the nose is really important, and I actually think it's an area that's sometimes rushed over. Now the problem with doing that is the nose can then sometimes look like it's not actually properly attached to the face. In some cases, if this darker area around the nose isn't mapped in, then it can make the fur almost look like it comes out of the nose itself. There should be that very slight narrow section of skin before the fur then starts. So this is definitely one of those areas where I like to make sure I pay very close attention to. Now onto the mouth. Where I'm starting to block in now my main shapes, I'm really focusing on the expression of the cat. Now this is one of my biggest tips when painting cats' mouths, the noses, is to make sure that we don't make this darker grey that I'm currently building in, that we don't make it too curved, because that can actually make the cat look like it's smiling. Now in some situations that curve may be more exaggerated from one cat to the next, so again this is something to really study in the reference photo. But most of the time, although it's curved, it's generally a bit more of a flatter curve, not anything that is too exaggerated. So we do want to be making sure that the angle here is correct. Now not only is that going to change the expression, but it then has a knock-on effect for the proportions. So if the mouth here is too curved, the cheek will then look too high up and so on. These things here really do affect the shape and form. So whilst I wait for the grey to dry, I'm now coming back in and working more on my contrast for the nose. Now at this second process of the nose, it's important to make sure that the paint has dried. So this is going to therefore allow a little bit more separation of those layers and more of my blending techniques. Now blending acrylics is something that I do focus my real-time tutorials on. If they are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. But what I'm doing here is applying the paint with one brush, and then I'm using another brush to very carefully blend or soften the edges. Now what this does is creates a very nice transition and that softness between one colour or one value to the next. So as you can see here, as I'm softening this, I'm creating a bit more of that curved shape of the nose, and this is going to become more exaggerated when I then pull in my highlights. Now, as a general rule, I usually like to finish with my highlights because they are what are catching the top layer of the nose. So making sure that I've got my darker values and the colour established first, and then moving on to my highlights is usually my go-to approach. Now, I say usually because there's no set rules. There are many occasions where I'll feel that I need to add something else. I need to enhance that contrast. I need to add a few more details. And with acrylics, we have that wonderful flexibility of being able to constantly layer on top as long as the layer underneath has dried. So now I'm finished with the nose, I can start to focus more on the surrounding fur. Now, the way that this is built up, it really does rely on capturing the fur direction correctly, building up the layers to maximize the depth, and also focusing on the softness through blending techniques. Now again, all of this I do cover thoroughly in my real-time versions. I record everything with a voiceover while I'm painting, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment. It makes even the most complex subjects far easier to tackle. Now, my main priority here with any base layer is to create a blended layer with no harsh edges, and that I'm hinting at the placement of my lights and my darks. Now, as you can see here, I am still moving my brush following the direction of that fur. Now, I am going to be adding more layers on top, so this isn't necessarily as important or as crucial, but I do find I'm more likely to follow the reference photo more accurately if I'm already moving my brush in the way that the details will be travelling when I get to that stage. Now, a big tip here is that we don't just want to block in with one solid colour. Look at the variations in the paint. I'm hinting where that fur has a little bit more of a browner tint. I'm always trying to capture the range of values. This is really going to help maximise that depth that is achieved. Now, I do strongly feel that the base layer has such an important role in the level of realism that is captured in the finished painting. Even though, as I've mentioned, we're going to be adding lots of paint on top, lots of layers, it's still that the base layer will show through and it affects the details that we put on top. Now, if the base layer has lots of harsh edges, those real rigid start and stop points, then the details are also going to look that way as well. The painting ends up having a bit more of a blocky effect, which is something, of course, we want to avoid when aiming for realism. Now, another big tip when working on fur like this is try not to paint in the lightest value at the base layer stage. Now, you can see from the photo of the finished painting in the corner how much lighter this fur is going to be when finished. So if we start off with a base layer that's too light, the details that we add on top will not show up. Now, ultimately then, when the painting is finished, the fur is going to look quite flat and overall too bright. So this is something here where the base layer again is going to be very important in ensuring the contrast is right. So once I'm happy with my base foundation, this is now where I can start mapping in some initial fur detailing and texture. Now, I can't stress enough that at this layer of the painting, I'm not trying to map in my brightest details first. I want to save those for my end layers. My goal for this is to really just hint at that accurate fur direction so that as I continue to build my layers and focus more on my values, I've already got the fur direction information mapped in on my painting. If this is correct at this stage, it gives me one less thing to focus on or think about throughout this layering process as I continue. Now, I very much try to simplify my tutorials as much as I can, so by working with this kind of a layering approach, I don't have to then have every consideration for each layer at the same time. It's more about building up the values and then in a moment adjusting that fur with glazes, where I'm then really simplifying this one process at a time. Now, glazing is something that I'm going to speak more about later on in this video, but I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm using various different examples of paintings and how glazes can be used in a variety of ways for different effects. If that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below. Now, one reason I like to work with glazes is purely because colour mixing can actually cause quite a lot of frustration throughout the painting process. So if we can eliminate that entirely and worry about colour separately, it just makes the entire painting process much easier and far more enjoyable. Now, something I want to mention here, I've already previously said about how important it is to make sure that the base layers aren't too light. And this is a great example. You can see how much lighter these layers look where I am continuing to add more contrast, but that's only possible because I made sure my base layers were dark enough. Now, there are situations where I actually overdo that and I make my base layers too dark. Now, if that happens, the wonderful thing about working with acrylics, as I say, is we can keep on layering. So wait for that layer to dry, come back in, lighten it, and then you can go back adding in your details. Now really, there's not going to be as much damage to the realism if the layers underneath are too dark because of how we can lighten it. But if we make a layer too light and we are worried about darkening that back up, as I've said here, that painting then is going to look less realistic. So having this consideration for the lights and the darks and the importance of contrast is what makes a painting look more realistic rather than the exact colour. Now, a great example of this is grayscale mediums or black and white paintings. If we were to paint just with black and white and create something that was grayscale, it's going to still look realistic if the values are right. It will just look like a black and white photograph. It's not about the exact colour that makes this painting look realistic. Now, I do have a Chihuahua tutorial here on YouTube and that is all in grayscale. So if that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below and you can really see there how the values are playing such an important role. Now, blending acrylics is something that I'm asked a lot of questions about. It's one of the trickier aspects of using this wonderful medium, but it can be a massive advantage. Now, when painting fur that's out of focus like this that overlaps a background, the faster drying time can cause a problem. But it also enables us to work through these stages of the techniques more individually at a quicker rate. So if creating the out of focus fur is something that you would like to see in a step-by-step tutorial, this one does cover all aspects. So as I say, I've linked all of the information to those in the description below. But if you do have questions about painting this specific fur texture, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments below. Now, I have briefly mentioned glazes, and in a moment here you're going to see that I'm now adjusting the colour of the fur. Now, throughout all of this layering process up to this point, I haven't considered the exact colour at all. I've only been focusing on building up my values so that I can just focus on contrast and the fur direction. Now, when I use glazes, I just add more water to my paint colour so that I've created a thinner mixture and adding that over a dry layer of paint wherever I need to adjust the colour of the fur, the feathers, the eyes, whatever it may be. Now, as you can see here, this enables me to really split these two sections of that painting process up. You can work with as many glazes as you want. You can allow that layer of glaze to dry and then re-establish it again to enhance that colour further. It really is a flexible way of working with the acrylics. But as I've mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do have a separate video about glazing and I have linked that below. So now I need to work on the chin and the lower part of the mouth. Now, before I can do that, I need to get the rest of the neck painted in because the longer hairs on the chin are sitting in front of the chest fur. So here I'm going to just skip forward because I'm going to use all of the same processes and building up those layers gradually to what I've shown for the rest of this painting. And then I can start to really focus on the rest of the mouth. So the first consideration here is the softness, but you can also see I'm lengthening my brush strokes. This here is a key part of building up the realism in the fur texture. Now, if we make our brush strokes all the same length, the fur again is going to look quite flat. It won't look as much like that animal as it should. So making sure we are adjusting, shortening or lengthening the brush strokes accordingly is something that we do want to notice in our reference photo. Now, when I start building in these lighter values, enhancing that fur direction, I want to be making sure that I'm still capturing the curve of the mouth correct. Now, this darker curve just above the area I'm currently painting is actually the shadow that's being cast from the top lip over the bottom lip. It's not necessarily that there is a dark section of the mouth. This isn't the gum. I want to be making sure, therefore, that that shadow has that softness. Now, one of the other things that can exaggerate that section of the mouth and that curve is whether or not that paint is too dark. So you can see directly below the nose, I've kept that fairly dark where that skin is a little bit darker in that section. But after that, it's more of a shadow, and then the brush strokes, those whiter details over the top, they will really then push back that darker area even more. But it is important to make sure that it's not too dark. Now at this stage of the painting, I'm really now focusing on where there are any details that are overlapping. Now this is going to add a lot of additional realism. By making sure that we are painting what's closer to the skin and building up from there, we can really maximise that depth yet again and take that portrait to the next level. So I do hope this video has been useful in how I would approach this section of a cat painting. The last element, of course, is the whiskers, and it's something that I absolutely love. It really does finish off the portrait. If you would like more advice, more tips on how to create long lines like this, I've got a couple of different videos here on YouTube. I will link those in the description below. I do upload 2 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, anything at all about working with acrylics, feel free to pop any questions in the comments below. I'm always happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.